those scriptures that I chose for tonight. I said earlier that we are in the middle of this Any Questions series. And so the question that I'm going to be addressing tonight, or at least trying to address, right, is what does it mean to be made in God's image? We've had some of our questions that have come out of the boxes have gone up on these boards around the room, and we've had kind of this community discussion over the last few weeks where we've been answering those almost like a Facebook thread, kind of giving each other our own 2 cents. That's kind of a good thing to do. But when I was kind of studying this question, kind of digging into this question, this idea kept coming back to me, and so it's something from when I was really little. So let's watch this real quick. There's no Big Bird at all in that clip from Sesame Street. What? Do you feel cheated? I don't feel cheated. I actually, when I first watched that again, I was like, oh my gosh, half the hipsters in Nashville are like wondering where those clothes are now. That's what's happening, I think. Today, diving into this question, I want to be clear that I don't necessarily have the answer, right? So I'm actually not even a, pastor, so to speak. But in our tradition here at Woodmont, we all serve one another and we all play a role in ministry. So tonight I'm going to be your minister. So that's pretty cool. And guess what? You guys are playing the role of my minister too, because we're in relationship with one another. So I'm going to start by telling you this story and why I've always loved Sundays. So when I was a little girl, I loved Sundays mostly because of Mr. Adler. He was a man in my mother's church. And he always baked these gorgeous loaves of bread. He considered it his ministry to bake the bread for the communion every week, and there was always leftover because the church wasn't really that big. So my sister Sarah and I, as soon as we were in our Sunday school room, we would hear the last line of the hymn playing, right? We would go racing down the hall, and good part was if you got to the door of the kitchen first, you got to have the best piece of bread, which is the center, right? Because no kid likes the crust, not even on communion bread, okay? So what we're looking for every Sunday, we hear the last bit of the hymn on the organ, down the hall. We go running down the hall and we dig into that soft, gorgeous center of bread. All right, you can kind of imagine that. Now let me tell you about somebody else on Sundays that I didn't like. So Mr. Adler, I did like. Mrs. P, my mom, I was telling my mom I was going to do this, and she was like, don't use her name. I said, okay. So Mrs. P was a church member that I really always tried to avoid because she was one of our Sunday school teachers, and she was really cranky and strict, and she was none too thrilled about the fact that the Sunday school teachers let us run in church or tear into the communion bread like a pack of wild dogs. So that was a little tricky. But most of the time, Mrs. P left me and my sister alone, although she really would mess with the other kids. She'd kind of hound them and poke them between their shoulder blades. And anytime anybody would ask a question that she didn't like, she would shut it down fast. It was crazy town. But she never really messed with me and my sister because we were the preacher's daughters, so we kind of had a little extra privilege, you see. But one day I went too far, and I'm going to tell you about that now. I think I was 6, which is a great age for theology because God is really wide open when you're 6, right? There's no limits on God. God is so big. But you couple that with the fact that most 6-year-olds are know-it-alls, and you have kind of an issue, okay? So Mrs. P was teaching our Sunday school class, and that particular Sunday she set out sheets of paper, and she asked for us all to draw a picture of God. So most of the kids really cooperated, and they drew, men in long robes with, big beards and stuff, and some of them even added a little thunderbolt for some extra points. So that was nice. Everybody got a little extra jolt of Jesus, right? And when it came to my paper, I drew something different. I drew a giraffe, and I was about to add myself on a saddle, like riding the giraffe, when I realized I was in a lot of trouble. I was in serious danger because Mrs. P's face was like bright red, and all of the veins in her neck were popping out. It was a real situation. And I knew in that moment, I was like, oh, there's going to be any spongy communion bread for me today. Like, I'm cut off. And so she grabbed me by the neck, that kind of death grip that mean Sunday school teachers can put on you, or like mean grandmas, So she grabbed me by the neck and she marched me down the hall to my mother's office. And as soon as the church had emptied out my mother, who was the pastor, she came in. And she seemed surprised to see us sitting in there. And Mrs. P was fuming, and I was sitting there sulking, right? And my mom is like hanging up her robe on the back of the, preacher robe, like on the back of the door. And she says, "What's going on?" Like all pleasant and polite. So Mrs. P tells my mother that I've been super disrespectful, and she explained the assignment she'd given us. And it was kind of like she almost got stuck in her own story. It was like she couldn't really break it to my mom that her daughter had such lousy theology, so she just like stuck out the picture of the giraffe and was like, "Look at this," she's all mad. And I knew my mother wasn't going to be mad, right? I knew she wasn't going to be mad about the giraffe, but I did know this. I did know that I was supposed to be polite to Mrs. P because we had talked about it a number of times. So, I knew I was kind of in this gray area. So my mom kind of gives me this look, right? She's like, "Be cool. This is my job." And she says, "Well, why did you draw a giraffe?" And I would have liked to have explained that nobody knows what God looks like, so it's a stupid assignment. But I didn't want to get in trouble for using the S word on top of everything, right? So I just kind of looked sideways at Mrs. P, and I said, "Nobody can tell what God looks like. The best we know, God looks like us." Okay, so I'm 6 years old, and I had this moment of clarity to say to my cranky Sunday school teacher, "Nobody knows what God looks like. The best we can tell, God looks like us." But I wonder if my whole life would have been different if I had been able to kind of stick with that idea my whole life long. Like if that had really undergirded my theology my whole life long. If I had been able to look in the mirror every morning, and when I was brushing my teeth, seeing the divine presence of God reflected back at me in the mirror. From deep inside my being, if I had understood that God was part of me and I was part of God, okay? I think my days would have been really different and just really open in a different way. If I could have deeply understood that God is love and that being made in the image of God means that each one of us really embodies love, then that would have made a difference not only in the way I treated other people, but also in the way I treated myself. See? The scripture, one of the 3 that David read earlier from Acts, Apostle Luke, so he wrote that book, and he says, we live and breathe and move in God. In God we have our being. I love this picture because I love the way the colors really intersect. It really sums up that scripture for me. In God we live and move and breathe and have our being. But to me, this scripture also kind of implies a symbiosis, right? So if we are living and breathing and moving in God, then that means God is also moving and living and breathing in each one of us. So as we're examining the question of what it means to be made in the image of God, we have to face our own selves and our own understanding of who we know God to be. So I think as a Christian, my ultimate goal is to look like my Creator. And I want to be clear about that. It's not that I want to be God or think I am God, but I do really long to be the best of all that I've been created to be. So if God made me in God's own image, I don't want to distort that or discolor it in any way. Because it's a real gift, right? It's a real gift to be made in the image of God. I think that one of the reasons that God made us in his image is so that we could see God in each other. So just for the sake of, kind of argument, think of some holy people that you know, people who've been vetted by the world, that, yep, that's a holy person, or, yep, you can really see God in that person. Can you think of somebody like that? Dalai Lama? Great. Mother Teresa? Yeah. Anybody else? Roland, my husband. I was thinking of Archbishop Desmond Tutu. So he is a civil rights activist from South Africa, and he's won the Nobel Peace Prize. He's done an incredible amount of things to transform our world. And he wrote this book called Made for Goodness. And I think, actually, I've read it probably 3 times this year. I think more of it's underlined, actually, than isn't. So I didn't use a very good strategy there. But he says that if we actually believed that we were made in the image of God, that we wouldn't shake hands when we meet one another. If we believed that the divine presence was housed inside each one of us, Bishop Tutu says that we would genuflect to one another, which is a fancy word for bowing. So can you imagine walking up to somebody and bowing? Like, that's so beautiful. Sam said the Dalai Lama, and actually that picture is Bishop Tutu and the Dalai Lama. I picked this picture because the Buddhists actually do this kind of genuflection or bowing with their greeting when they say namaste. If you've ever done yoga, you've seen that before, right? Namaste. And what it means, literally translated, is it means I bow to your true self. But notice that language. I bow to your true self. So I show respect to your true self, not who I think you should be, not who you necessarily think you are, but to the deepest essence of who you are. And when we look at the very deepest pieces of ourself, I think God is really reflected. The image of God shines really unobscured by whatever we have put in our own way. It's for this reason that some scholars have actually translated namaste to mean the God in me greets the God in you, which I think is really cool. I love that. Bishop Tutu is really good friends with the Dalai Lama, and they do all these speaking engagements together. And Bishop Tutu writes about how impressed he is with the Dalai Lama because he has so much reason to be bitter. He has every right to be bitter, really. I mean, he's been in exile from India for over 50 years. And Tutu says that the Dalai Lama is actually patently holy. And he explains that when you meet him, there is no doubt that you are in a presence of God. He doesn't say you are in the presence of God. He says you are in a presence of God, as if all of us have that shot too, He says, the Dalai Lama carries in his being the essence of joy that is the gift of a person with nothing to prove. So from my perspective, cultivating a deep, true understanding of being made in God's image could transform us into being joyful people with nothing to prove, too. A couple of years ago, Stephen and I were invited to play music at this church in Los Angeles called All People's Christian Church. And the church has a really long and vibrant history. They've been bringing together all kinds of unlikely friends in social outreach and community worship for about 70 years. But for the last 15 years, like, the demographic of South LA has really changed, and there's a lot of gang activity. So All People's decided that they were going to work up a gang ministry. So they've got this little ratty 1950s building in the middle of a really rough side of LA. And it's actually a refuge in the middle of a war zone where people are literally killing each other over turf. The members of All People's they work really hard to look past the violent behavior of the gang members in their neighborhood. And they make a real effort to see the living God in the faces of the young people around them. So it's with this understanding of who God is and how God moves that they have the ability to continue a tradition of forgiveness and grace and unconditional love. The morning Stephen and I were there, the passing of the peace at All Peoples, which actually I think Chris has a picture of their sign. It's really neat. It's very 70s. It's like a 70s theme tonight. The passing of the peace, that we do where I said, say a kind word to one another. They do it in kind of a different way. Now, remember, I said their building is kind of ratty, and I say that sweetly, right? But the people would move all around. So they'd be shaking hands with each other and hugging one another and being kind to one another. And they'd sing this little song, and it was, the Jesus in me greets the Jesus in you. The Jesus in you greets the Jesus in me. You're easy to love. You're easy to love. And I was so moved. I was like, here I am, the guest musician, and I'm like, it's kind of embarrassing. Like, these people are singing to me, and I'm singing to them. But really, to look somebody in the eye and say, the Jesus in me. So you have to have that ownership of that. And then you have to look somebody in the eye and see it in them, in a stranger that you don't know. It's so amazing. It's such an embodiment and such a powerful moment. All right, so think back to that story where I was being a super know-it-all in Sunday school. I was thinking about today, and I was thinking maybe I wouldn't have gotten in so much trouble if I had drawn Mrs. P instead of the giraffe. If I could have been broad enough in my understanding of faith to know that when I said, the best we can tell, God looks like us, that also meant, too, that we are called to actually see God in one another. If I could have seen Jesus in Mrs. P instead of a mean old Sunday school teacher, I might have gotten to the center of that communion bread. Maybe getting near to the heart of God is seeing God in each other. The ones of us who are easy to love and the ones of us who aren't so easy to love. Maybe getting near to the heart of God is seeing God in ourselves too. Bishop Tutu writes, to live fully in the understanding that we are made in God's likeness means that we are fundamentally good, that we are fundamentally whole, that we are fundamentally made for hope and joy and peace. If we embrace this idea that we ourselves are good and whole and made for hope and joy and peace, that in fact we reflect our Creator's goodness in our very lives, maybe that could actually be a method for achieving peace on earth. It would be a radical change in the way we interact with one another and with ourselves. It's hard work, of course, to live into the reality of being made in God's image. I'm not saying, like I walk around every day feeling totally at ease with this whole idea. But I do know that it calls for me and for all of us to set aside our rash reactions and our quick tempers, our frustration, our greed, our egos. But when we get it right and we are able to be honest about who and whose we are, we begin to move towards the center of life itself, where the heart of God is beating out the rhythm of our days. Amen. I was asking Stephen at home, we're married, this guy and me. I was asking Stephen at home, hey, what song should we sing on Sunday? And he had this great idea for this song, so I'm going to call the band to come back up. It was kind of funny because we were in this little tiff, like, you sing it, no, you sing it, no, you sing it, no, you sing it, because this song is written by this iconic musician. Nobody wanted to screw it up, so. But I really feel like this song really sums up what we've been talking about tonight, and this is the time for offering in our service. And offering, actually, this song is all about making an offering of your life. And so as the offering baskets go around with the deacons, I'm going to ask the deacons to hang out just a second, but you all have little cards in your seats, so you can just write a little something on there, a prayer that we could offer for you, something that you need help with, something that you're celebrating, and just, we'd love to know more about who you are and connect with you.